December 20th, 1944. The village of Cheneux, Belgium. Lieutenant James Megellas crouched in a frozen ditch, watching German SS troops fortify positions 400 yards across an open field. Behind him, paratroopers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment checked their weapons in the pre-dawn darkness. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Among those weapons were German Panzerfausts, disposable anti-tank rockets, captured 3 months earlier in Holland. The Americans shouldn't have had these weapons. The Panzerfaust violated standard military doctrine. Soldiers were supposed to fight with issued equipment, not enemy arms. Captured weapons complicated supply chains, created identification problems, and raised questions about the laws of war. Yet here they were, American paratroopers preparing to attack elite German armor with Germany's own weapons. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't measured in lives. This is the documented story of how one airborne division discovered that sometimes the enemy builds better weapons than you do, and sometimes survival means breaking the rules. The Panzerfaust, literally armor fist in German, represented a revolution in infantry anti-tank warfare. First deployed in 1943, it consisted of a simple steel tube containing a propellant charge of black powder. The warhead, a shaped charge containing 3 pounds of high explosives mixed with TNT and hexogen, could penetrate 8 inches of solid steel armor. The weapon was disposable. Fire once, throw away the tube. The design was crude, almost primitive, but it worked. The American military had its own anti-tank weapon, the 2.75-inch bazooka. It required a 2-man crew, weighed 13 pounds, and penetrated roughly half an inch of armor plate with each hit. The Panzerfaust, by contrast, could be operated by 1 soldier, weighed 11 pounds, and punched holes 5 times larger. When American troops first encountered these weapons in combat, the difference was immediately obvious. The United States 82nd Airborne Division, the All-Americans, had been fighting since Sicily in 1943. By September 1944, they had jumped into combat 4 times, more than any other American airborne unit. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy. Each operation taught brutal lessons about fighting German forces. One lesson stood above all others. German armor was better than anything the Americans had. The Panther tank, with its sloped armor and long 75mm gun, could destroy American Shermans from ranges where return fire was impossible. The Tiger, with frontal armor over 4 inches thick, was effectively invulnerable to most American anti-tank weapons. Paratroopers, dropped behind enemy lines without heavy weapons, faced these machines with bazookas that barely scratched their paint. Major General James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne, understood the problem intimately. At 37 years old, Gavin was the youngest division commander in the American Army. He had jumped with his men in every operation, earning their respect by sharing their danger. He knew that paratroopers facing German armor needed better weapons. The question was where to find them. September 17th, 1944. Operation Market Garden began with the largest airborne assault in history. Over 35,000 paratroopers from American, British and Polish units dropped into Holland to seize bridges ahead of advancing British armor. The plan was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Capture bridges at Eindhoven, Nijmegen and Arnhem, creating a corridor straight into Germany's industrial heartland. The 82nd Airborne's objective was Nijmegen, the critical middle link in this chain of bridges. At 1300 hours, transport aircraft carrying the 504th, 505th and 508th Parachute Infantry regiments crossed into Dutch airspace. German anti-aircraft fire was surprisingly light. Within minutes, paratroopers were floating down onto drop zones near Groesbeek, Overasselt and Grave. The initial landings went better than expected. By 1800 hours on the first day, the 504th PIR had captured the bridge at Grave at 1,600 feet, the longest bridge in Europe. They'd also seized several smaller bridges over the Maasweiler Canal. German resistance was scattered, disorganized. The drops had achieved complete tactical surprise, but surprise couldn't last forever. By the second day, German reinforcements were flooding into the area. Elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division reached Nijmegen, occupying the road bridge that was the 82nd's primary objective. What should have been a quick seizure of an undefended bridge became a 3-day battle for a fortified position. During the fighting around Nijmegen, American paratroopers encountered German positions equipped with Panzerfausts. The weapons lay scattered in abandoned defensive positions, stacked in ammunition dumps, left behind by retreating troops. Some paratroopers picked them up out of curiosity. Others, veterans of previous campaigns, recognized immediately what they'd found. Sergeant Ross Carter of the 504th PIR later described finding an entire German ammunition storage dump near Groesbeek. The site had been used as a training area, and when Nijmegen was bombed, many German troops had fled eastward toward Germany, leaving behind thousands of rounds of ammunition and crates of Panzerfausts. For infantry soldiers who'd spent months fighting with inadequate anti-tank weapons, the discovery felt like Christmas. The paratroopers had no authorization to use captured enemy weapons. Official doctrine was clear: American troops fought with American equipment, but official doctrine was written by staff officers who'd never faced a Panther tank with, only a bazooka. The men on the ground made different calculations. Colonel Reuben Tucker, commanding the 504th PIR, brought the issue to General Gavin. Tucker was direct. The Panzerfaust was significantly more effective than the bazooka against German armour. His men wanted to keep them. Gavin's response was characteristically pragmatic. If the weapons helped his paratroopers survive, they could keep them. He'd worry about regulations later. The decision reflected Gavin's command philosophy. Unlike many senior officers, he'd actually used the weapons his men carried. He'd fired bazookas at German tanks. He understood their limitations. When his paratroopers found something better, he wasn't going to stop them from using it out of bureaucratic stubbornness. Not everyone agreed. Some staff officers argued that using enemy weapons created identification problems. How would other American units know these weren't German troops? Others worried about ammunition. Resupply Panzerfausts were single-use weapons. What happened when they ran out? The concerns weren't without merit, but they assumed the war would be fought according to peacetime planning assumptions. The reality on the ground was messier. The bridge at Nijmegen fell to the 82nd on September 20th, after a legendary daylight assault crossing of the Waal River. Major Julian Cook's battalion crossed in canvas boats under murderous German fire, suffered terrible casualties, but took the northern end of the bridge. British tanks rushed across from the south. By evening, the city was secure, but Operation Market Garden had already failed. To the north at Arnhem, British paratroopers were surrounded and being destroyed. The ground advance had bogged down on a single narrow road the troops nicknamed Hell's Highway. German forces cut the corridor repeatedly, isolating the airborne units. What was supposed to be a quick thrust into Germany became a costly stalemate. The 82nd held its positions around Nijmegen for 56 days. During that time, they faced constant German counterattacks from the Reichswald forest to the east. The fighting was grinding, attritional warfare, nothing like the rapid mobile operations airborne forces were designed for. But they held. Throughout this period, American paratroopers used captured Panzerfausts whenever they could get them. The weapons proved devastatingly effective. A well-placed Panzerfaust could mission-kill even the heaviest German armour. The psychological impact was significant. Infantry, who'd felt helpless against German tanks, now had a weapon that evened the odds. Sergeant First Class George Montilio of the 505th PIR later recalled watching a German Panther tank approaching his position near Groesbeek. His squad had 2 bazookas and 1 captured Panzerfaust. The bazookas fired first, their rockets bouncing off the Panther's sloped frontal armour. Then the soldier with Panzerfaust moved to a flanking position and fired. The shaped charge detonated against the Panther's thinner side armour, and the tank erupted in flames. The crew never made it out. The effectiveness wasn't just about penetration. The Panzerfaust's warhead created massive behind-armour effects. Where a bazooka might punch a small hole, the Panzerfaust generated a jet of molten metal and explosive gases that killed crew members and ignited ammunition. Tanks hit by Panzerfausts rarely survived. By November, when Canadian forces finally relieved the 82nd at Nijmegen, the division had accumulated a substantial stockpile of captured German weapons. They took them back to France. General Gavin had already decided what to do with them. The division established rest camps near Reims in mid-November. Exhausted paratroopers, many of whom hadn't had real rest since before D-Day, got passes to Paris. They visited cafes, attended shows, tried to forget the war for a few days. Their respite wouldn't last long. While the men relaxed, Gavin met with his regimental commanders. Market Garden had exposed serious gaps in American airborne anti-armour capability. The bazooka was inadequate. The larger 3.5-inch bazooka hadn't reached frontline units in sufficient numbers. If they faced German armour again, and they certainly would, his paratroopers needed better weapons. The solution was obvious. Train the entire division to use captured Panzerfausts. Make proficiency with the German weapon as standard as rifle marksmanship. When they went back into combat, every company would have men qualified to use them effectively. The decision was still technically irregular. Army regulations didn't provide for training soldiers on enemy equipment, but Gavin had broad authority as a combat division commander, and he used it. Training began in late November. The Panzerfaust was surprisingly simple to operate. Remove the safety cap from the rear of the tube. Unfold the simple flip-up sight. Tuck the tube under your arm, not on your shoulder. The back blast would injure you. Aim slightly above the target to compensate for the slow-moving projectile's arc. Press the firing pin. The weapon had serious limitations. Maximum effective range was barely 30 yards with the Panzerfaust 30 model, 60 yards with the improved 60 model they'd captured. That meant getting dangerously close to your target. The massive backblast, a jet of flame extending 6 feet behind the weapon, gave away your position instantly, and you couldn't reload. One shot, then you needed another weapon. But if you could accept those limitations, the Panzerfaust could kill any tank on the battlefield. That made it worth the risk. The training wasn't elaborate. Live fire exercises were impossible. They didn't have enough captured Panzerfausts to waste on practice. Instead, instructors used dummy weapons to teach proper handling and aiming. They emphasized the critical importance of proper firing position. Men who'd fired bazookas from their shoulders had to unlearn that habit. The Panzerfaust's backblast would incinerate anyone standing directly behind the weapon. Paratroopers learned to fire from covered positions when possible. Shoot from a window, then move to a different position before German infantry could return fire. Use the smoke and confusion created by the Panzerfaust's massive discharge to break contact, hit and move. Never stay in one place after firing. By mid-December, hundreds of 82nd Airborne paratroopers had qualified in Panzerfaust operation. They didn't know when they'd use these skills. Most expected they'd be dropped into Germany itself, probably in the spring of 1945. The German army was clearly beaten. It was just a matter of time. On the evening of December 17th, Colonel Tucker received an urgent summons to division headquarters. When he arrived, General Gavin gave him the news. The Germans had launched a massive offensive in Belgium. Panzer divisions were breaking through American positions in the Ardennes forest. The 82nd was moving out immediately. The paratroopers loaded onto trucks in darkness. There was no time for detailed briefings. The original destination was Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was heading. But as the convoy rolled through the night, new orders came. The 82nd would go to Werbermont instead, farther north, where the situation was more critical. They arrived on December 19th. The temperature had dropped below freezing. Snow covered the ground. The Germans had launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West. Over 200,000 German troops and more than 1,000 tanks were pushing toward the Meuse River, trying to split the Allied armies and capture Antwerp. The 82nd Airborne deployed along the northern face of the German penetration. Their mission was to hold a defensive line over 25,000 yards long, an impossible distance for one division. They dug foxholes in frozen ground and waited. Intelligence reports indicated they faced elite SS Panzer divisions. The 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Hitler's bodyguard division, was somewhere to their front. So was the 2nd SS Panzer Das Reich and the 9th SS Panzer Hohenstaufen. These weren't the tired Wehrmacht units the Americans had been facing lately. These were fanatics, with the best equipment Germany could still produce. The paratroopers who'd fought at Nijmegen remembered what SS troops were like. They didn't surrender easily. They didn't break. And they had Tiger tanks. On December 20th, Colonel Tucker received orders to attack. His 504th PIR would assault the village of Cheneux, 2 miles north of their positions. Intelligence indicated German armour had occupied the town. Tucker called his battalion commanders together to issue orders. The 1st Battalion, -A Company, would lead the assault. They'd advance from the village of Rahir toward Cheneux, along a road flanked by woods. It was a narrow approach, easily defended. Tucker knew the attack would be costly. What he didn't tell higher headquarters was what weapons his men would be carrying. Along with their rifles, grenades, and bazookas, many paratroopers carried captured German Panzerfausts. They'd been trained to use them. Now they'd find out if the training would keep them alive. At 1400 hours on December 20th, the attack began. What happened next would prove that sometimes the best weapon to use against German tanks is the one the Germans designed themselves. The 1st Battalion moved out from Rahir at 1400 hours. Companies B and C deployed in a column along the narrow road and toward Cheneux, moving through thin woodland that offered minimal cover. The temperature hovered just below freezing. Snow crunched under their boots. Every sound seemed magnified in the winter silence. Within minutes they made contact. German machine guns opened fire from concealed positions in the woods. Mortars began dropping rounds along the road. The paratroopers went to ground, returning fire, trying to identify enemy positions through the bare trees. This wasn't the kind of fighting airborne troops preferred. There was no maneuver room, no way to flank the enemy on this narrow approach. Then Company B spotted something that changed their calculations. Abandoned on the side of the road sat a German 77mm self-propelled howitzer. The crew had fled, leaving the vehicle intact. Several paratroopers who'd received artillery training examined it quickly. The gun was functional. Ammunition was still loaded. Lieutenant James Megellas made a decision. They'd use the captured German gun to support their attack. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. American paratroopers attacking German positions with a German artillery piece. But irony didn't win battles. Firepower did. The howitzer crew brought the gun onto the road and engaged German machine gun positions. The 77mm shells were devastating at close range, tearing through German defensive positions and forcing the enemy to fall back. Company B advanced 300 yards before encountering the next obstacle. As they approached Cheneux, the character of German resistance changed dramatically. The sporadic machine gun fire was replaced by concentrated fire from heavy weapons. 20mm flak wagons, anti-aircraft guns mounted on half-tracks, began firing horizontally into the American advance. The high-velocity explosive shells tore through trees and equipment with horrifying effectiveness. One burst caught 6 paratroopers in the open. They died instantly. The radio operator was among them, his equipment shattered. The battalion lost communication with regiment headquarters. They were on their own. The captured howitzer tried to return fire, but the 20mm guns forced it back into cover. The German flak wagons, designed to shoot down aircraft, were equally effective against ground targets. Their rate of fire and accuracy made advancing impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Willard Harrison, commanding 1st Battalion, assessed the situation from a covered position. They'd stumbled into something significantly larger than anticipated. Intelligence had suggested a German rearguard in Cheneux. What they'd found was a major defensive position, probably held by battalion strength or greater, with armour support. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Harrison had requested tank destroyer support for the attack. 2 M36 Jackson's tank destroyers mounting 90mm guns were supposed to accompany the assault, but the lieutenant commanding them refused to advance, arguing his vehicles were no match for the German armour reportedly in Cheneux. He kept his Jacksons in the rear, out of the fight. Harrison didn't have time to argue. His men were pinned down under increasingly heavy fire. If they stayed in place, German mortars would systematically destroy them. They had to keep moving forward. He ordered the attack to continue. 2 platoons would advance along both sides of the road, using fire and movement tactics. One element moved while the other provided covering fire. It was basic infantry doctrine, executed under the worst possible conditions. As they closed with Cheneux, the paratroopers got their first clear look at what they were facing. The village sat on slightly elevated ground, providing the defenders with excellent fields of fire across the 400 yards of open ground the Americans would have to cross. German troops had fortified buildings and dug fighting positions. More importantly, armour was clearly visible half-tracks, flak wagons, and what looked like at least one heavy tank. The open ground was crisscrossed with barbed wire fences every 15 yards. Agricultural fencing, intended for livestock, now served as obstacle barriers. The Germans had excellent visibility across the entire kill zone. Any assault across that ground would be suicidal. But Harrison had his orders. Cheneux had to be taken. At this point, Lieutenant Megellas made a tactical decision that would be studied in after-action reports for years afterward. Instead of attempting a frontal assault across the open ground, he led his platoon on a wide flanking movement through the woods to the north. The maneuver was risky. It meant moving without support, potentially getting cut off if the Germans counterattacked. But it offered the only realistic chance of getting close enough to the German positions to use their most effective weapons, the Panzerfausts. Megellas's platoon moved through heavy woods, trying to maintain noise discipline despite the need for speed. Behind them, the rest of the battalion kept up suppressive fire to distract the German defenders. The plan was simple. Get within 30 yards of German armour without being detected, fire the Panzerfausts, then assault through the resulting chaos. Doctrine said this couldn't work. Infantry didn't voluntarily close to within 30 yards of enemy tanks. The risk was too high. But doctrine assumed you had effective long-range anti-tank weapons. The paratroopers didn't. They had Panzerfausts, or nothing. As evening approached, Megellas's platoon reached their assault position. Through the trees, they could see German vehicles clearly now. Several half-tracks mounting 20mm guns, multiple trucks, artillery pieces. And yes, at least one heavy tank, it looked like a Mark VI Tiger, though identification was difficult in the fading light. The Tiger was the problem. 60 tons of armour, mounting an 88mm gun that could destroy any American tank from 2,000 yards. Its frontal armour was over 4 inches thick, effectively impervious to most American anti-tank weapons. Even the 90mm guns on the M36 tank destroyers had difficulty penetrating Tigers frontally. But the Panzerfaust didn't need to penetrate frontal armour. It just needed to hit the tank's sides or rear, where armour was thinner. Megellas positioned his men carefully. 3 soldiers carried Panzerfausts captured at Nijmegen. They'd all trained on the weapons at Reims. Now they'd discover if training translated to effectiveness under combat conditions. The first soldier moved to within 25 yards of a German half-track. He removed the safety cap, tucked the Panzerfaust tube under his arm, aimed at the vehicle's flank, and fired. The shaped charge detonated with a tremendous blast. The half-track's thin armour offered no protection against the jet of molten metal that penetrated its hull. Secondary explosions followed as onboard ammunition cooked off. The vehicle erupted in flames. German crew members who tried to escape were cut down by rifle fire. The massive backblast from the Panzerfaust gave away the firer's position immediately. German infantry began directing fire toward the woods. But the psychological impact of losing a vehicle to a weapon they'd assumed only they possessed created momentary confusion. American troops didn't have Panzerfausts. Where had this come from? The second soldier used that confusion to get into position. He targeted one of the 20mm flak wagons that had been devastating the American advance. At 30 yards range, he fired. Another successful hit. The flak wagon's crew died in the explosion. Now the Germans understood they were being attacked from multiple directions. The concentrated defence they'd established facing the open ground to the south had to be reoriented to meet threats from the woods. German infantry began moving toward the northern edge of the village. This was exactly what Harrison had hoped for. With German attention divided, he ordered the rest of the battalion to assault across the open ground. It was still dangerous. The barbed wire and German fire would take casualties, but it was no longer suicidal. The paratroopers advanced through the obstacle belt. Some men used wire cutters. Others simply threw themselves over the barbed wire, accepting lacerations to maintain momentum. German fire was heavy but less concentrated than it would have been if the defenders hadn't been distracted by the flanking attack. The third soldier, with a Panzerfaust, waited for the perfect shot. As the Tiger tank began traversing its turret to engage the American assault, he fired at its thinner side armour. The shaped charge punched through. What happened inside the tank is known only from German after-action reports, but the result was clear. The Tiger stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from its hatches. The crew bailed out and ran. By nightfall on December 20th, American forces had entered Cheneux, but the battle was far from over. The Germans still held strong positions in the village centre. The fighting devolved into house-to-house combat, the most brutal form of infantry warfare. Paratroopers cleared buildings room by room, using grenades and close-quarters shooting. German troops fought back with equal ferocity. This was where the 82nd's training at Salerno, Anzio, and Normandy paid dividends. They knew how to fight in buildings. They understood room clearing, improvised demolitions, and the bitter mathematics of urban combat. The SS troops facing them were also veterans, but they were being attacked on multiple axes simultaneously, preventing them from organizing an effective defense. Throughout the night, the battle continued. American paratroopers used every captured German weapon they could find. Panzerfausts destroyed several more vehicles attempting to retreat from the village. German machine guns captured intact were turned against their former owners. Even German stick grenades, found in abandoned positions, were used against German troops. Colonel Tucker committed the 3rd Battalion to the fight, sending them on a wide flanking manoeuvre to enter Cheneux from the north through the hamlet of Monceau. This was classic airborne tactics, multiple small units attacking from unexpected directions, creating chaos and preventing the enemy from forming coherent defensive lines. By mid-morning on December 21st, Cheneux was in American hands. The cost had been significant. The 1st Battalion suffered heavy casualties, including many men killed in the initial approach, but they'd destroyed or captured an impressive amount of German equipment. The final tally, documented in official after-action reports, included 14 flak wagons, 6 half-tracks, 4 trucks, 4 105mm field artillery pieces, and 1 Mark VI Tiger tank. The Germans also abandoned substantial quantities of ammunition and supplies. More importantly, they'd stopped Kampfgruppe Piper, the spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division's attack. Piper had been racing toward the Meuse River, trying to break through American lines before reinforcements arrived. His force of 4,800 men and 600 vehicles was supposed to lead the entire 6th Panzer Army to Antwerp. Cheneux was a critical point in his advance. The battle at Cheneux demonstrated something that American military planners had been reluctant to acknowledge. German small arms and anti-tank weapons were, in many cases, superior to American equivalents. The Panzerfaust's effectiveness against heavy armor exceeded anything in the American infantry arsenal. Acknowledging this didn't diminish American industrial capacity or strategic success. It simply recognized tactical reality. General Gavin understood this completely. After Cheneux, he formalized the 80 seconds policy on captured weapons. Any German Panzerfausts found were to be collected and redistributed to combat units. Training in their use would be standardized. The weapons were no longer contraband to be quietly tolerated. They were official equipment. This decision was still irregular by standard military procedure, but Gavin had the combat record to justify it. His division had been in continuous combat since Sicily. They'd fought in 4 major campaigns and countless smaller engagements. If they said the Panzerfaust was necessary, who was going to contradict them? The battle in the Ardennes continued for weeks. The 82nd held their sector of the northern shoulder against repeated German attacks. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, tried to break through on December 23rd, attacking from the south and overrunning positions held by the 325th Glider Infantry at the Barak-Freicher crossroads. The breakthrough threatened to outflank the entire 82nd Airborne position, but the German offensive was losing momentum. Fuel shortages, caused by the American defense of critical fuel depots, left German armor immobilized. Allied air power, grounded during the initial attack by bad weather, returned with devastating effect once the skies cleared. And everywhere the Germans attacked, they found American units that refused to break. The 82nd Airborne's use of captured Panzerfausts became increasingly sophisticated during this period. They learned to position teams with multiple weapons, allowing them to engage several targets in rapid succession before German forces could react. They developed tactics for urban fighting, where the Panzerfaust's short range was less of a disadvantage, and they shared their knowledge with other American units facing similar challenges. By early January 1945, the German offensive had completely stalled. The bulge in American lines, which gave the battle its name, began contracting as American forces counterattacked. The 82nd participated in these counteroffensives, pushing German forces back toward the Siegfried Line. On January 3rd, the 82nd attacked. On the first day of fighting, they overran the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division and elements of the 9th SS Panzer Division, capturing 2,400 prisoners. The destruction of these German units marked the effective end of the offensive on the northern shoulder. Germany's last major attack in the west had failed. The 82nd was finally pulled out of the line on January 10th, 1945. They'd been in continuous combat for 24 days. Casualties had been severe. The 505th PIR alone lost more than 50% of its strength. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, and suffering from combat fatigue. They were sent to different towns in Belgium to rest and refit. At Theoux, Spa, and other villages, Belgian civilians welcomed the battered paratroopers into their homes. For many of these civilians, the Americans were the second liberation force they'd welcomed in 4 months. The first had been in September during Market Garden, before the Germans counterattacked and reoccupied much of Belgium. During this rest period, something remarkable happened. The 82nd received formal training in the use of Panzerfausts, not informal familiarization conducted by combat veterans, but actual organized instruction with training aids and standardized curriculum. General Gavin personally supervised the training program. His reasoning was documented in division records. The Panzerfaust was the only effective weapon infantry could rely upon against heavy German battle tanks such as the Tiger Mark VI, King Tiger, Panther, Jagdpanther, and Jagdtiger. American anti-tank weapons simply weren't adequate for the threat they faced. This represented a remarkable admission by a division commander. Gavin was essentially stating that American weapons development had failed to provide infantry with the tools they needed. He was publicly declaring that captured enemy equipment was superior to issued American gear. This could have been career-ending. Instead, it was accepted as combat reality. The training program lasted from January 12th to January 20th. Thousands of paratroopers learned proper Panzerfaust handling, aiming techniques, and tactical employment. The weapons were no longer improvised solutions. They were standard equipment. The final phase of the 82nd's involvement in the Battle of the Bulge began on January 28, 1945. Their objective was to attack through the Belgian forest near Bullingen, pushing German forces back across the German border. The weather was brutal temperatures well below freezing, deep snow making movement exhausting. The regiment advanced in columns of 2 along narrow forest trails. German resistance was initially light, consisting of scattered infantry units and occasional artillery fire. But as they approached the Siegfried Line, Germany's frontier fortifications' resistance intensified dramatically. The Siegfried Line consisted of hundreds of concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire. It had been built in the 1930s as Germany's western defensive wall. American forces had breached portions of it in the fall of 1944, but the German counter-offensive had pushed the front back, and now these fortifications were occupied and active again. On February 1st, the 82nd received orders to assault through the Belgian Fort Gerolstein sector of the Siegfried Line. The 1st and 2nd battalions of the 504th PIR would lead the attack. They would move cautiously from bunker to bunker, clearing each position, before advancing to the next. The tactical problem was immediately apparent. The bunkers were concrete pillboxes, with walls several feet thick, designed to withstand direct hits from tank guns. American infantry weapons, rifles, machine guns, even bazookas were largely ineffective against these structures. The only reliable way to destroy them was with satchel charges placed directly against firing ports, which meant getting within a few yards of bunkers whose machine guns commanded clear fields of fire. It was a recipe for massive casualties. Unless they had a better way. The Panzerfaust, it turned out, worked remarkably well against concrete bunkers. The shaped charge, designed to penetrate tank armor, could also punch through reinforced concrete. More importantly, the Panzerfaust could be fired from greater range than hand-placed satchel charges, reducing exposure to German defensive fire. Ironically, the German army's own weapon became one of the most effective tools for destroying German fortifications. The paratroopers would identify a bunker, maneuver to get a clear shot at its firing ports or thinner side walls, and engage with Panzerfausts. The massive blast often stunned defenders, even if it didn't fully penetrate, allowing assault teams to close with grenades and satchel charges to finish the job. The attack through the Siegfried Line took days of bitter fighting. Every bunker had to be individually assaulted. German troops fought from prepared positions with clear fields of fire. The snow made movement difficult and left tracks that made surprise impossible. But slowly, methodically, the 82nd advanced. By mid-February, they'd penetrated the Siegfried Line and were advancing into Germany itself. For many paratroopers, this represented a psychological turning point. They were no longer fighting to liberate occupied countries. They were bringing the war to Germany's territory. The end was in sight. The 82nd continued combat operations through March and April. They participated in the drive across the Rhine, the reduction of the Ruhr pocket, and finally the advance toward the Elbe River. By the time they reached the Elbe in early May, the war in Europe was effectively over. German forces were surrendering en masse. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed. On May 2, 1945, the 82nd Airborne accepted the surrender of over 150,000 German soldiers from the 21st Army. General Gavin's division, which had entered the war with fewer than 15,000 men, accepted the surrender of an entire German army. Among the countless individual stories of the 82nd War, the tale of the captured Panzerfausts stands out for what it reveals about adaptation, pragmatism, and survival. When official equipment proved inadequate, soldiers improvised. When doctrine failed to match reality, leaders changed the doctrine. The decision to use captured German weapons wasn't taken lightly. It violated standard procedures, complicated logistics, and raised legitimate concerns about friendly fire incidents. But it worked. And in combat, what works matters more than what's officially approved. The broader impact of the 82nd's experience with the Panzerfaust extended beyond one division's tactical innovations. American weapons developers studied captured Panzerfausts extensively. The post-war M72 Law-Light anti-tank weapon borrowed heavily from the Panzerfaust's disposable design philosophy. So did numerous other anti-tank weapons developed in the decades after World War II. The Soviet Union, which captured enormous quantities of Panzerfausts during their advance into Germany, was even more directly influenced. The RPG-2, which entered Soviet service in the 1940s, was essentially a reloadable Panzerfaust. Its descendants, the RPG-7 and later variants, would become among the most widely distributed weapons in history. In this sense, the German Panzerfaust's design influenced anti-tank warfare for generations. American paratroopers who used captured Panzerfausts in 1944 and 45 were unknowingly demonstrating concepts that would reshape infantry tactics worldwide. But for the men who fought at Cheneux, Bastogne, and the Siegfried Line, none of that mattered. They weren't thinking about post-war weapons development. They were focused on staying alive long enough to go home. The Panzerfaust helped them do that. That was its only importance to them. Lieutenant James Megellas survived the war and eventually wrote his memoirs, documenting the 82nd's campaigns in detail. He described the Panzerfaust as the great equalizer, the weapon that finally gave infantry a realistic chance against German armour. His account, and those of dozens of other veterans, preserved the story of how American soldiers learned to use enemy weapons to screen of other survive. General Gavin's career flourished after the war. He became the Army's Chief of Research and Development, then commanded the 7th Army in Europe. His willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and embrace tactical innovations marked him as one of the war's most effective combat leaders. The decision to authorize use of captured Panzerfausts was typical of his pragmatic approach to warfare. The 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment received a Presidential Unit citation for their action at Cheneux. The citation noted their courage in attacking superior forces under difficult conditions, but it didn't specifically mention the captured German weapons they'd used. Some things were better left out of official records. By war's end, the use of captured enemy equipment had become relatively common in American forces. Soldiers used German machine guns, submachine guns, and other weapons when circumstances warranted. The Panzerfaust was simply the most visible example of this practical approach to warfare. The story of the 82nd Airborne and their illegal-shaped charges illustrates a fundamental truth about combat. War is not fought according to peacetime regulations. Survival depends on adaptation. When soldiers discover that enemy weapons work better than their own equipment, they use enemy weapons. When official doctrine proves inadequate, they create new doctrine. The paratroopers who picked up those first Panzerfausts at Nijmegen in September 1944 had no idea they were starting a process that would influence their division's entire approach to anti-armor warfare. They simply recognized an effective weapon when they saw one. The decision to keep using these weapons, to train with them, and eventually to make them standard equipment represented layers of command decisions by officers from lieutenants to generals. Each of these decisions involved risk. Using enemy weapons created identification problems that could lead to friendly fire incidents. It complicated supply and maintenance. It meant accepting that official American equipment wasn't always the best available, but the alternative was sending infantry against German armor with inadequate weapons. That risk was unacceptable. The legacy of the 82nd Airborne's experience with captured Panzerfausts extends beyond military history. It demonstrates how organizations can adapt when confronted with evidence that their standard procedures are insufficient. The military hierarchy could have punished Gavin and his paratroopers for violating weapons protocols. Instead, it recognized that combat veterans knew more about fighting effectiveness than peacetime planners did. This willingness to learn from experience, even when it contradicted official doctrine, helped the American military succeed in World War II. Other armies, particularly the German and Soviet forces, showed similar adaptability in different contexts. The armies that won were often those most willing to abandon failed concepts and embrace what actually worked. For the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne who fought through Sicily, Italy, France, Holland, Belgium, and Germany, the war was a series of immediate tactical problems requiring immediate solutions. The Panzerfaust was one solution among many. They used it because it helped them accomplish their missions and survive. The broader implications were for others to consider. In the final analysis, the story of American paratroopers using German anti-tank weapons reveals something fundamental about warfare. Technology matters, but adaptability matters more. Having the best equipment helps, but being willing to use whatever works is often more important. The 82nd Airborne didn't have the best anti-tank weapons in their arsenal, so they took them from the enemy and used them to win. That pragmatic, flexible approach to combat helped win the war in Europe. It demonstrated that American forces, when led by competent commanders and composed of well-trained soldiers, could adapt to any challenge. They didn't need to have better equipment than the enemy, though American industrial capacity usually ensured they did. They just needed to be willing to learn, adapt, and use whatever gave them an advantage. The paratroopers who jumped into Holland in September 1944, expecting a quick operation, instead spent months in brutal combat. They adapted to every challenge: urban warfare, defensive operations, winter combat, and finally offensive operations into Germany itself. Using captured Panzerfausts was just one adaptation among many, but it symbolized their entire approach. Identify what works, use it, survive, win. That approach, repeated across thousands of small unit actions by millions of American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, ultimately defeated the Axis powers. The 82nd Airborne story is remarkable not because it's unique, but because it's representative. American forces won not through superior firepower alone, though they had that, but through superior adaptability, combined with industrial strength. The decision to use captured German weapons might have been technically illegal according to peacetime regulations, but in war, survival trumps regulations. The paratroopers who broke those rules lived to go home. That was the only measurement that mattered to them. History has judged they made the right choice. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.